I can dispense with introductions for most of you. I've already had the opportunity to meet and speak with many of you on other occasions. My name is Lucia, and I am a philosophy teacher at New Acropolis. Our aim today is to talk about the myth of King Arthur. This is an interesting topic because it was one of the reasons that brought me to New Acropolis in the first place. I have always been very fond of this myth. It was one of my first lectures, and I have always found the story of King Arthur fascinating. And even though nowadays we may not have a very specific background to understand what a myth truly is, you know that feeling that there must be something more behind it, that it should be more than just a simple story. And indeed, myths are much more than just simple stories. This is the fundamental message of this lecture. The myth of King Arthur serves as a demonstration for you to understand that mythic language is not just a story to entertain children. It is a very profound language, one that conveys knowledge directly connected to our lives. So we will talk a little about how this myth was born briefly, since that is not our main focus, a bit about what the myth is, and essentially the symbolism of the myth, which is what truly interests us. You know that nowadays, more than ever, this subject is in vogue. Recently, yet another film was made, a huge series, where they tried to reconstruct the story of King Arthur, focusing on the historical aspect of King Arthur. To this day, there is still debate about whether Arthur existed or not. Was there truly an Arthur in history, or was there not? And there is still an ongoing discussion on this matter. A multitude of facts and data are brought up. From a philosophical perspective, whether Arthur existed as a historical figure or not is irrelevant. It does not hold the great importance we might initially think, especially when we place too much value on the descriptive aspect of history. What is fundamental is the message that this mythical cycle brings to humanity, the language through which this cycle expresses itself, and what it has to say to us. So basically, how did this whole story begin? It is said that everything begins when Rome withdraws from Britain. You know that Rome, with all its standards of civilization, with all its norms that for that era were extremely advanced, a very high level of organization. When Rome colonized that region of England, the south, and established its colony there, Britain became an island of wealth, structure, and organization in the midst of a barbaric world, surrounded on all sides by peoples considered barbarians. Picts, Scots, Saxons, and those peoples without much Jutes, and those peoples without much ability to defend themselves, without Rome, without any means at all. When Rome, due to a process of historical decline that we know very well already in the 5th century, was no longer able to sustain such a distant colony, and even the defense of Rome's own territories became very difficult, Emperor Honorius ordered the withdrawal of the distant troops he had stationed in Britain. He ordered the withdrawal of the Roman legions that guarded Britain, and he left Britain to its own fate. So who were the Britons? The Britons were Romanized Celts, highly civilized, cultured, accustomed to urban life in the Roman style, surrounded by barbarians on all sides. When Rome withdrew, these people found themselves in a difficult situation with no means to defend themselves. Their neighbors were, in fact, much more powerful militarily than they were. And thus begins a whole sequence of attacks and defenses until a certain king, who up to this point is a historical figure, a Briton king by the name of Vortigern, decides to form an alliance with one of the barbarian peoples in an attempt to prevent the imminent invasion by the others. He forms an alliance with the Saxons, and these Saxons, upon entering Britain, realized that there was great wealth there, and that rather than being allies of the Britons, it would be far more advantageous to dominate them and annex that territory. And so begins an entire process of struggle and confrontation, especially with the Saxons. It is a curious and fascinating story because it creates a bridge to the myth. The story is intriguing because at a certain point, you can no longer tell where history ends and where the mythical part begins. Why is that? When Vortigern makes this move, which is considered a grave political mistake, the entire population of Britain turns against him because he had handed over his people without even giving them the right to fight. He brings the Saxons into his own land, and this causes him to go down in history as a weak king, a feeble ruler. And then the Druids, who were the Celtic priests, had a very interesting policy regarding kings. Curiously, the Druids were much more powerful than the kings themselves. They believed that the king was wedded to the land. You and the land are one. So when the king weds the land and he is no longer worthy of his bride, the land begins to wither. It ceases to bear fruit, to blossom. Famine begins, and the whole process of the land's withdrawal sets in. So what did they do? The only solution was to make the land a widow. That is, to give her a more worthy husband, and then she would flourish once again. So they would execute the kings who were timid. You can imagine the level of power these druids held. That is why it is said that Celtic societies were more theocratic than truly monarchical, because the druid held more power than anyone else. When Gorton, who was knowledgeable in the law, realized that things were heading in that direction, that he would be executed, he gathered his court and fled. And he fled far to the north, to a region close to what we now know as Wales, where he considered himself safe, where he would not be reached. And in this region, we enter a part that is more myth than history, for it is said that he wished to build a fortress so secure that the Britons could not enter and forcibly remove him. And every time he began to lay the foundations of this fortress, everything would collapse. The earth would tremble, crumble, and everything would fall apart. He could not understand why this was happening, so he summoned all the magicians with him and asked them to perform auguries to find the cause of this misfortune. And these magicians declared that a blood sacrifice was necessary, that an orphan child needed to be sacrificed beneath the foundations of that fortress. And so they set out to find who would be the victim. Curiously, near this region, there was a small village where a boy lived who was deeply unwanted and feared by everyone. It is said that there was a very powerful landowner in this region who had a very beautiful daughter and wished to arrange a good marriage for her. And for this purpose, he isolates his daughter in an ivory tower where she has no contact with anyone until he finds the ideal suitor. She is not even allowed to see anyone so that no one would desire her. And this young woman, very beautiful, it is said that one day, a kind of elemental being, an angel, enters through the window of the tower, joins with her, and she conceives a child. When the girl appears pregnant, her father is overcome with consternation and dies of grief, for he could never have foreseen such a thing. He did not know how it could have happened, and she is judged in the city for the betrayal she is believed to have committed against her father, and so on. What happens is that this child is born speaking, defends her mother in court, and terrifies everyone, because she is born speaking and with the mental abilities of an adult. She is a being who is part divine, part human. She is given the name Merlin. When her mother passes away, no one wants to take responsibility for this child. She becomes a child cast out into the city, left to its corners, both feared and everyone believes and says that she must be the daughter of the devil. Imagine, if you will, what a fitting situation this is. When Vortigern's guards arrive in the city, searching for a child to be sacrificed, if you lived in that city, whom would you recommend? This solution came at just the right time. Everyone unanimously points to Merlin, and Merlin is taken away. Curiously, he goes with great calm, fully aware of what is about to happen. When he stands before Gorton, he says, "Look, your priests know nothing. Well, you may sacrifice me, but you'll barely manage to irrigate the land with the little blood I have. And you will not build anything. That is not the real problem. The real problem is that beneath this land, 2 dragons are at war. One is the dragon of your royal house, and the other is the dragon of the royal house of Pendragon. A black dragon against a red dragon. And as they fight, they clash and the earth trembles. I can cast a spell for you to make the earth stop trembling, but I cannot change destiny. The Pendragons will come here and they will kill us. Sooner or later, no one can change that, because that is the meaning of history." And Vortigern is deeply impressed by a child speaking all those things, knowing all of this, and so he takes the boy as his advisor. He does not execute him or anything of the sort. Instead, he takes the boy as his counselor. In fact, the boy performs an enchantment that makes it possible for the earth to stop trembling, and the fortress is built. But exactly as he had foreseen, it does not take long before Zurio and his brother Pendragon arrive there, and they kill Vortigern. They send him to the earth and return to fight for control of the land, which was already completely fragmented. They bring Merlin with them, who by this time is already an adult. He becomes the advisor, the tutor, who will watch over the unification of the land of Britain. One land, one king. According to the myth, This was regarded by Merlin as a mission. And so, he would make every effort to ensure that Britain would be unified under a single worthy king. And now we will enter the realm of myth. In just a moment, we will continue this story, but this serves as a bridge between the historical part and the mythical part. Why is that? Vortigern is the historical figure. As for Merlin, that is uncertain. Merlin, Maglin, Barths, this is another point of curiosity because within the Celtic structure there was a priestly hierarchy. The first stage was to be a bard. Much like, for example, within the hierarchy of the Catholic Church among cardinals, bishops, archbishops, and so on, one would begin as a bard who was a singer. It was similar to being a minstrel. He would sing his teachings. He would turn his teachings into music. After this stage, one would become a bait. At that point, he was already a priest with knowledge of medicine and healing. And finally, the pinnacle of this druidic path was to become a true druid, which comes from druid, meaning one who sees far. He was someone who possessed a vision for the future, an extraordinary mastery of the mysteries of nature. So it is said that at first Mervi or Mirodan, he was a bard. And this mysterious figure, who is woven throughout the entire story, has no historical evidence of his existence. Just as there is none for Arthur, there are countless hypotheses to suit every preference you might have. Some say that Arthur was Ambrosius Aurelianus, a Romanized Briton, a general. Others claim that no, he was actually a Breton general named Riadamus. There are those who say he never existed at all, absolutely nothing. Some even say, and there are those who claim, that this is historically proven. Today in Tintagel in Cornwall, England, a piece of stone was found inscribed with the name Artorius, in that fortress where it is said Arthur was born. In Glastonbury, a tomb was found bearing the names of Arthur and Guinevere, but it was empty. It is impossible to say to what extent this was done. Already in a later period, this was done in reference to the myth. In short, many things are said, but as for historical proof, there is none. Up to this point, there is no certainty that the historical figure of Arthur or the historical figure of Merlin ever existed, and they are the essence of this myth we are discussing. However, as I was saying to you from a philosophical perspective, this great debate, this quest to know whether Arthur existed or not, is irrelevant. The myth possesses an enormous symbolic richness and speaks to our lives, to who we are, to the human journey, and it does not depend on whether or not there is a historical figure behind it. There is always some kind of historical facet, even if it is not exactly as we imagine it. In fact, it is extremely unlikely that Arthur was a king. There were no kings in Britain at that time. Most likely, if he existed, he was a military leader, a general, and it was not a kingdom as elaborate as we imagine it to be. We imagine it is. Well, the structure of myths, the etymology of the word myth, comes from mutus, meaning one who is silent, which is the same root as the word mute. It refers to that which is hidden behind the story. History would have a descriptive body and a mythical soul, which is its essence. History tells us how things happened, myth tells us why. The myth, as the essence of facts, provides the reason why. It is a temporal language because it speaks of certain ideas, of certain reasons, of an essence that lies behind human action at any moment in time and space. Ancient traditions used to say that myth would be the world of human ideals. Myth would be the ideal form of action. Some call this an archetype. Archetype is nothing more than a slightly more sophisticated word to refer to a model, to an ideal. Myth is exactly that, a model of perfect conduct. So imagine a model of an object. I always tell my students, for example, that they will imagine a model for a piece of clothing, a pair of pants with life. Those who are already my students know this example well. You buy a lesson in the Moda E. Mordred magazine. You see something similar to this, don't you? This is a model of a pair of pants. A model is different from an object. You don't wear this. This is just an idea. When you add substance to it, fabric, zipper, button, then it becomes the object you are wearing. The model is not the same as the actual thing. It is just an idea. And when you add substance to it, it becomes reality. Do you understand this? So, can you imagine a seamstress? To arrive at this model, she had to search throughout history. In fact, it's an interesting fact because it is said that those who first started wearing continuous trousers were precisely the Celts, the Bracci. So imagine that they must have searched for an ideal model to create this piece of clothing. And they arrived at this model, and then it became established, because for a long time this has been the model that is used. It is the ideal one to produce this result. If we stop wearing long pants and 500 years from now, start wearing them again, the seamstresses will probably search, and eventually arrive at this same model once more. Because it is the ideal model to produce this result. Well, is it only objects that have models? Or could there also be models for events? What these ancient traditions say is that there can and should be a model for everything. There can indeed be models for events. In other words, how do we face the challenges of human life that will help us evolve as human beings? Could there be a model for that? Says there can be. Consider that a human being is a being in evolution with a journey, a starting point. And what about the destination point of the human journey? This starting point would be almost like that limit, that frontier between man and animal, and the destination point, which is called the ideal. It would be the highest perfection you can comprehend in the human form. It would be the pinnacle of values, virtues, and wisdom. This here would be the human journey. Now, between this and that, there are several stages, of course. Nature does not make leaps. And these stages, could it be that there isn't an ideal way to face them? Each of these difficulties, each step along the path, might there not be a model that could teach us how to face each of these things with perfection, with wisdom, and produce the best result? It is said that, yes, there are models for events, models for actions, models for life. Myth is a model of how a human being can ascend to another evolutionary stage, another stage of consciousness, another step, a model of an event, a model of life. And therefore, it stands above any particular time or place. It is timeless. Why? Because the Roman man, the Greek man, we ourselves, the people of the future, the stages we must face to get from here to there are the same. Dealing with life, dealing with death, dealing with loss, dealing with desire, dealing with frustration, will this ever be different? Or will it change at some point? It is always the same thing. Valuing what is real, escaping illusions, knowing how to deal with our choices, knowing how to control our temperament, it is always the same thing. In any time, in any place, the basic human question remains the same. Therefore, the models for achieving optimal and ideal behavior, in light of this, are always the same. Myth is the myth of humanity. Therefore, we make a simplification when we speak of Celtic myths, or Egyptian myths, or Greek myths, because myths belong to humanity. Myths are models, they are abstractions. Now, at a certain moment, these models descend to earth in symbols that are unique to each of these civilizations. So, if, for example, I take the classic example used for this, which is the myth of the hero, this is the ideal way for a person to face situations of limits, of fear, and of desire. This is the myth of the hero. It teaches how a person should face situations of limitation. This myth is timeless and belongs to humanity. Now, when it descends, when it takes form in Egypt, it assumes an Egyptian form. When it takes form in Greece, it is another. For example, in Greece, the hero is Hercules, or it is Achilles. In India, it is Arjuna. Among the Celts, it is Arthur. Among the Incas, it is Pachacuti, Inca, or Bono. They are different, but if you look closely, their conduct follows exactly the same pattern, the same script. So this is a symbol. A symbol is the moment when the myth takes on an image within time and space, one that is suited to the civilization in which you live. Why is that? For a rather obvious reason. Because it is much easier to grasp an image in the face of difficulty than an abstraction, because the myth is very abstract. And when faced with an extreme situation, a difficult situation, what did the myth of the hero say? Now there's a lion over there roaring at you. I'm recalling the hero myth. You can't do that, folks. You need it quick. So what do you remember? The symbol. The symbol tells you what you would do. What would you do? Hercules. What would Achilles do? And the answer comes quickly. This is interesting. That is why Plato said that every human being should have a hero close to their heart. Because it is a symbol that one evokes in moments of extremity. Someone you admire, someone whose story you know deeply, someone who, for you, is a symbol of life. When faced with a critical situation, you ask yourself, what would that person do? Clearly appears to you, doesn't it? They would do this. Well, whether you are able to do it or not is another matter, but you will see what that person would do. That person would do it, yes. So here we come to a second aspect of the question. This is interesting because it is a framework that we will use frequently throughout the lecture. So it is good that I draw it out right away. It is the scheme of the three worlds that the Greeks used. They saw that the human being is composed of three worlds. A spiritual part, which they called nous. A psychological part, which is mind and emotions, which they called psyche. And a physical part, which is called soma. According to the Greek tradition, the human being would be the union of these three worlds. We can use the same framework of the three worlds to understand the structure of myth. So here you would have the myth. In the spiritual world, in the world of ideas. Here you would already have it on the psychological plane. You would have the symbol, which is that which you evoke, and it gives you an immediate response. What would so-and-so do? And down below, already on the physical plane, what would that be? Imagine that you have great esteem, a great admiration for the figure of Achilles. Knows everything. Do you know? All of the Odyssey, no, not the Odyssey, the Iliad, pardon me, you know the entire Iliad, every detail, what Achilles was like, his choice of a short and glorious life, everything he did in battle. You have a great admiration for this figure. Well, at the moment a question arises, at the moment an element or a decision appears, you think, what would Achilles do here? Usually it becomes very clear to you, well, he would do this. We rarely have any doubt. It's clear. A hero of that stature would have no doubt. His attitude would be this one. But, as I mentioned to you, the fact that you reach this conclusion does not necessarily mean you are able to act on it. It may be that, at this moment, you are not able to give that same response. But you will know that this is what you should have done. This, my friends, is the essence of philosophy. Philosophy tells you, it gives you tools so that you can perceive. What would be the ideal? And this will be within your conscience. Well, what I was able to do was this. But I know that the ideal was that. And you will have to live with that. Do you think you will be able to endure spending your whole life knowing that the right thing would have been this? That what you were able to do was so much less? Do you think you will be able to endure, to live with, and passively accept this conscious mediocrity? The greatest ally of our inertia is unconsciousness. When we do not know what we should have done, we can remain like this our entire lives. But when we know, our conscience will hold us accountable. Look, you weren't able to do it, but that was the right thing. Look, at some point, you will have to find a way to do this because you know that the direction would be. Do you understand this? So you must have a division, a duality that your conscience will demand from you. And at a certain moment, you will equip yourself and acquire the tools to act exactly as Achilles would act. In other words, a difficulty will arise that is symbolically identical with the same symbolic content, and at that moment, now this opportunity finds you. Boom! You do exactly what Achilles would do. Do you realize that in that moment you were Achilles? He descended into the world through you. You mythologized that moment in your life. This is what was traditionally called myth. What was myth? It was the sacralization of life. The Greeks used to say that there are only two things for you to do in life. Either you trivialize life, living according to any model, or you sacralize life when you live according to myths. That is, in that moment you embodied Arthur, you embodied Achilles. He came into the world, he became flesh and bone through you. In Rome, they used to call this an illo tempore, outside of time. It is the moment you steal from time for eternity. Greek mythology also speaks about this. The great activity of humanity is to steal moments from thrones for God, to steal moments from time for eternity. In that moment of yours, you were more than just a simple human being. You were Ulysses, you were Achilles, you were Arthur. This is a moment outside of time, a moment of eternity. It was sacred, it was the sacralization of life. So, this question of the right would be the moment when the right descends into the world, takes on flesh and bone, takes on life, right? So that would be the idea. Rights enter the world through symbols that are experienced and thus generate a practical transformation in the lives of human beings. This is a curiosity that we could bring up. Ours is a society that works with borrowed symbols. Have you ever noticed this? We do not generate our own symbols. We have lost the understanding of the importance of creating our own symbols. We work with borrowed symbols. It's not that there aren't human beings capable of doing this. It's not that there aren't examples to be used by people, but because this is not valued within our society. So when we need symbols, we have to borrow them from the Greeks, the Egyptians, the Hindus, the Celts. We do not generate our own symbols. Plato said that a society without heroes is a society doomed to remain in mediocrity, because people forget how great they can become. They lose sight of how great they can be. So everything ends up being leveled from below, and people come to believe that what is average is the highest one can be. They lose sight of their own horizon of possibilities. Celtic. So this is the first element for us to understand. Now let us delve into Guido himself. Well, as I mentioned to you, history is told by many authors and on many occasions. There are some names that are very well known. The first of them is a bishop named Geoffrey of Monmouth, who is the first to write, so to speak. In fact, he is not exactly the first. He is the last to write with historical intent. He claims to have found a book written by a Briton that would tell the story of Arthur. The fact is that no one has ever found this book. No one knows whether he invented this story or not. But he is the first to narrate it with historical pretensions, with many details, speaking of Arthur, of Merlin, of Mordred, recounting the story. More or less as we know it, even mentioning Morgana. So Geoffrey in the 12th century would be the last major push in the direction of seeking a certain historicity. From that point on, it enters the realm of literature itself, of the novel. Later, we will have a Frenchman, Chrétien de Troyes, who will write extensively about the Arthurian rite. We will also have a German, Wolfram von Eckembart. This Wolfram von Eckembart is interesting because it is upon his work that Wagner will base his Parsifal, which is a beautiful version of Parsifal written by Wolfram von Eckembart, which, by the way, is one of Wagner's masterpieces. And we have Thomas Malory. What will he write? Robert de Boron as well, the Frenchman, and Thomas Malory, who writes The Death of Arthur, which is a version we will work with extensively. Now, countless other possibilities exist. In fact, the story of King Arthur became a cycle, with peripheral tales that have nothing to do with the main events. There, at the center, we have Tristan and Isolde, Balin and Balan, and a multitude of other stories that, if we were to recount them all, we would spend the entire night here. So, evidently, we had to select a historical thread to follow. We are working with Malory, The Death of Arthur. Now, for example, among the films available, it is interesting to make this recommendation, watch Excalibur. Of everything that has been filmed on this subject, as far as I know, there is nothing better. Nothing that so deeply respects the atmosphere of the myth, nothing so faithful, and nothing so well crafted. and it is made precisely based on this version as well, which is The Death of Arthur by Thomas Malory. And as you watch the film after this lecture, you will have the opportunity to notice other elements that at first glance we do not see. Has everyone here already had the chance to watch Excalibur? Has anyone not seen Excalibur? Watch it. You will see that after this lecture, even those who have already watched it will be able to notice a whole series of other details. So we are going to follow more or less the same narrative line as Excalibur, which is based on the book by Thomas Malory. However, at certain moments, I will add things that are not present in the film. Is that all right? The story of Malory begins at the moment when Arthur had not even been born yet, at the moment when Uther Pendragon, who would become Arthur's father, is fighting for the unification of the lands of Britain. Merlin, who returns with him, remember Vortigern's fortress, returns alongside him and says to him, "Look, at this moment Britain is completely fractured. But there are easier enemies and there are more difficult enemies. I will give you the following mission. There is a certain river that separates the fortress of Tintagel, which was where the Duke of Cornwall reigned. This Duke of Cornwall is a very powerful enemy. He will be the last one you will face, because at this moment you would not be able to confront him. Now, on this side of the river, there is a group of lesser lords. These are the ones you are able to face. You must confront them all, unify them, and ensure that they all accept you as king. If you succeed in this, then I will give you a precious artifact to help you pursue your mission, the Sword of Power, which was forged when the world was created. I will give you this sword, for it is the sword of will. Before it, the Duke of Cornwall may yield to you and accept you as king. Without it, you have no chance at all. But first, you will have to unify all the people who are Hindu. After that, you will go and face the Duke of Cornwall, with Excalibur in your hands, and the other receives this as his mission, so leave it to me. He was a great warrior, but a warrior with a completely wild and untamable temperament. A great warrior, truly excellent, a warrior. However, he did not possess enough virtues to be a king. But he goes, fights, and conquers all those lands of Acon of the river. He manages to make all the warriors, all the lords of the land, accept him as king. And so the story begins exactly in this way. Uther then goes looking for Merlin so that he may fulfill his promise. Hand over the Sword of Power, hand over Excalibur. And then Merlin appears. As he had promised, he gives Excalibur. And with Excalibur in his possession, he goes to the riverbank, where the Duke was already waiting for him, on the other side, already aware of this. And he says, "Accept me as king, for I possess Excalibur." And faced with this argument, they come to an agreement on the division of power and land, and the Duke of Cornwall accepts him as king. Then they cross the river to hold a great celebration and commemorate the final unification that America dreamed of, the unification of Britain under a single king. Is that clear? Well, let's pause here. Let's cross a little into the symbolic realm to understand what is happening. Now, observe these things, everyone. Here's a different way to express the same idea here. The Hindu tradition says that human beings are composed of a spiritual part and a material part. This spiritual part, in many traditions, in many places, is associated with the number 3. You may have already noticed this. How the number 3 is present in religious symbolism everywhere. There are the triads: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, Isis, Osiris, and Horus, and so on. A number 3 has always been closely associated with the sacred for various reasons. It is a symbolic number, and not only the number 3, but also the geometric forms that reflect the number 3. A two-dimensional geometric shape, the triangle, is used by the Hindus. A three-dimensional geometric shape, the pyramid, is used by the Egyptians, or the cone, which is used by the Celts, but always with the same symbolism related to the sacred. So for the Hindus, there is a sacred spiritual aspect of humanity, represented by the triangle. And there is a material, mortal aspect in humanity, which is also associated with the symbolic number, the number 4. Of the 4 elements, earth, water, air, and fire, this would be the mortal square of humanity, which the Greeks later called personality or persona, the mask with which a person comes into the world. And this personality, this mortal aspect, would be separated into 4 distinct elements which, to put it simply and LT, break time equals 0.5s/ in GT, are composed of the physical body, an energetic body, and an emotional body. And a mental body or lower mind. I will not go into details here. These are essentially the elements that make up the personality. What is humanity's great dilemma? It is that these elements, the physical body, energetic body, emotional body, and mental body, are not unified. Each of them has its own desires, and they struggle among themselves. For example, the astral or emotional body is driven by passions. The physical body seeks the path of least resistance. The energetic body aims for the greatest possible conservation of energy, and the mental body is inclined to speculate. In other words, there is a contradiction among the desires of these material vehicles of the human being. And this causes great difficulty for a person to achieve clarity regarding their objectives, as if each part of their body wanted to move in a different direction. If your arm moved one way, your leg another, and your torso yet another, it would be very difficult to reconcile them. Therefore, when a person manages to harmonize these parts, they gain access to make the crossing and to enter in this spiritual plane, which is called the triad or ego, or the spiritual element of the human being. Now we will make a transformation here. The triad, the triangle of Venusius, becomes the cone of the color of air. Is that not so? Cornuario is precisely the land of the horn or the cone, which was sacred to the Celts. The cornucopia is a tradition that has Celtic origins. Cernunnos, who is the god of horns of cones, was the most sacred of the Celtic gods. Why is that? For them, the cone represented the spiritual. It is the same symbolism as the triangle for the Hindus. Do not be surprised. Both peoples, though so distant geographically, both Celts and Hindus, are of Indo-European origin. Therefore, there are similar symbolic traits. So, the cone has for the Hindus the same symbolism as the triangle for the cone for the Celts has the same symbolism as the triangle for the Hindus. And down here a river flows, doesn't it? And what is down here? A Brittany completely divided, completely impassioned. Why does Merlin instruct Wagner to do this? To unify those lands. If you unify the lands on this side of the river, I will give you Excalibur. And then you will be able to enter the lands of the Duke of Cornwall. Do you realize what is happening here? It is exactly the same saga that we find in all traditions. Master this here. Let your will reign over the 4 elements. And then you are able to cross the river and reign in Cornwall. It is the entry of human consciousness into this mortal and divine aspect. That is what this is about. And why is Excalibur necessary? Excalibur is the sword of will. The human will, as those who study philosophy already know, is said to be the greatest power, the most divine power that humanity possesses. When, in fact, Luther manages to overcome and unify all of this, it means that he has already conquered his will, because only a person of great power, of great determination, is able to control themselves. For those who are familiar with that tradition, the Buddhist Dhammapada, it is said that more victorious than one who wins 1,000 external battles is the one who conquers themselves. This person who has conquered themselves, who has managed to unify these vehicles, possesses the will. When Luther is able to do this, he already possesses will, power, and determination. Excalibur is merely a symbol indicating that he has, in fact, achieved this conquest. It is the sword of power, signifying that he has attained sufficient will, and therefore this mastery over oneself. This mastery allows him to dare, to desire, to cross the river and enter the spiritual plane, to enter Cornwall. And in possession of Excalibur, the sword of will, Uther stands before the river. On the other side, on the opposite bank, is the Duke of Cornwall, and he says, "Accept me, for I have Excalibur." The Duke asks what he proposes, and he offers an agreement, showing himself to be quite flexible. If the Duke accepts him as king, the lands from there to the sea would belong to him, the Duke of Cornwall, and under these conditions, the Duke accepts and invites him so that the unification may be celebrated in his castle, at Tintagel Castle. So Uther's entire army crosses the river, and they go very festively to Tintagel Castle to celebrate one land and one king. However, upon arriving there, the Duke of Cornwall, who had an exceptionally beautiful wife named Igraine, decides to show off before his guests and asks his lovely wife to perform a dance. And so Igraine begins to perform a beautiful dance before the guests. Uther Kjelgavir, though usually in control of his instincts, falls madly in love with this lady, losing his head and becoming passionately enamored with her. He decides to risk everything to such an extent that he becomes obsessed and wants to have Igraine for himself, no matter what. What happens? He throws it all away. He had unified everything, peace was established, all was calm. Merlin is driven mad by this. He simply declares war on the Duke of Cornwall for his wife, for Igraine. Merlin is beside himself with this, but realizes that there is no point in investing in Uther. That Uther was not truly a man, that Uther would have to undergo a profound transformation to be worthy of being a king, because with such an attitude, he would lose the respect of all the lords of the land. He would have no moral authority to reign. Therefore, there was no point in investing in Uther. Something would have to be done, another king would have to be brought forth. And so Uther goes to Merlin and says, "Look, I'd do anything to have one night with the queen." And he said, "Yes, anything." Then Merlin says, "Very well, I do have that night with the queen. However, the fruit of this union that will be conceived in this encounter belongs to me. When the child is born, you tell me, and you hand the child over to me. Leave it to me. I will raise the child. That is the condition." And Uther, driven mad by passion, agrees to this pact with Merlin. He agrees, as long as there is a way for him to possess the queen. So Merlin, with all the enchantments and all the spells he knew, possessed knowledge of something even more powerful than all of them, the spell of transmutation. He then invokes the spell of transmutation, calling upon the breath of the dragon. It is curious. The dragon symbolism in China is also notable in Celtic mythology. It represents the manifested universe. Do you recall the Chinese hawk with a ball in its hand? That ball is the lake, the manifested universe. In Celtic tradition, it's the same idea. The dragon is the manifested universe. To invoke, to unleash the dragon, is to call upon the powers of the universe. He then invokes these powers and performs the transmutation so that Uther could take on the appearance of the Duke of Cornwall. He could enter the castle and spend a night with Igraine, just as he intended, for Igraine was tremendously virtuous and faithful to her husband. She would not spend a night with any man who was not her husband. So he takes on the form of the Duke of Cornwall, enters the castle. The Duke had gone out to battle. He spends a night with Igraine and conceives. But meanwhile, the Duke had been killed in battle. The next day, Igraine discovers that her husband had been killed at the beginning of the night, but at the same time, her husband had spent the night with her. And so there is this confusion, you see. What does it mean to see the body? Once the Duke is dead, Uther joins with her. And when the child is born, Merlin appears, as had been agreed, to take the baby. He then takes little Arthur. born in Tintagel, a newborn, from his mother's arms and disappears with the child. At that moment, Uther regrets the pact he had made and runs after Merlin, trying to get the child back. He is caught in an ambush and is assassinated, but before being assassinated, he takes the sword of power, Excalibur, and thrusts it into a stone, and there, on that magically inscribed stone, it is declared that whoever manages to pull it out will be the new king of England. And no one succeeds. Uther is killed, and the sword remains in the stone for a long time, with no one able to draw it out. Now, moving to a symbolic perspective, what does this mean? You will see that this is common across various traditions. The idea is that for a person to enter a spiritual plane, for human consciousness to access the spiritual realm, it must be profound, profoundly transmuted. It means changing one's values, changing one's perception of life, altering one's standards of success and reputation. It is as if the person is reborn, purified, in order to reign in this new plane. Remember, several traditions speak about this, the Bible itself. Verily I tell you that no one will enter the kingdom of heaven unless he is born again. Do you remember Jesus' Tristan there in Colemos? All traditions have more or less. That is by dying that one is born to eternal life. Saint Francis of Assisi. Give up your life. If you want to live, this is the voice of Tibetan silence. That's what medieval alchemists said. Solves and coagulates. Dissolves as a mortal being, and it coagulates, it is reborn as a spiritual being. In other words, you will enter this world. Man is practically born again. He goes through a transmutation spell when he is reborn, purified in this world. The spell of transmutation that Luther undergoes is the union with love and beauty, which is represented by a grain. United with a grain, it is as if he undergoes a transmutation and is reborn, purified in ATU. Curiously, the interesting element that Plato mentions is that not only religions have triads, but philosophies do as well. Plato has a triad. He says that these were the attributes of the sacred par excellence, which are the good, the beautiful, and the just. Now, he will say that among these three attributes, the easiest for humans to perceive is the beautiful. For those who read the Symposium, for example, he talks about this, that through the pursuit of beauty, a person can reach God, because beauty is a divine attribute that is most perceptible on the material plane. For example, if someone were to walk in here right now, let's say 5 minutes ago they entered, can we tell if this person is just? Can we tell if they are good? But if they are beautiful, we notice it immediately, isn't that so? Beauty in the material realm is the most perceptible divine attribute. In fact, Plato says, and I was talking about this earlier this month, we will even have a lecture here. I will be speaking about platonic love here at the National Theater. He said that when a human being, even if driven by instinct, unconsciously pursues beautiful bodies, they are actually seeking the attribute of the divine. Because an animal does not seek out another only when it is beautiful. That does not exist. Even on the physical plane, even when driven by the most instinctive impulses, the need for beautiful bodies is an unconscious need for eternity. So, carried by the beauty of grants, carried by the transmutation of love into beauty, the womb is reborn, purified in Arthur. It is he himself. You will see that this happens twice in this myth. Through longing, he too will be reborn, purified. The first case here of the spell of transmutation is the birth of Arthur. It is the womb purified through the action of love and beauty. He enters the spiritual plane and is reborn, worthy to reign then. So it is as if Arthur were a new womb, purified through love and beauty. Celtic. Okay. Well, continuing with our story, you will see that this baby is taken by Merlin and raised by a peasant who, at first, out of fear of Merlin, and later, because he becomes attached to the child, a peasant who is quite noble, raises the boy as if he were his own son. But this peasant had an older son, Kay, whose dream was to become a knight. In fact, in this region, everyone's dream was to become a knight, because the idea becomes immortalized that someone must pull the sword from the stone. So they begin to hold tournaments where knights compete for the right to try to pull the sword from the stone, and no one had ever succeeded. So the younger ones from boyhood begin to receive training to become squires, and the older ones, after a certain age, become knights, and they go on to compete in tournaments for the right to try to pull the sword from the stone. And then Arthur, a teenager, a boy, a page. For the first time, he is going to be his brother Kay's squire at Kay's first tournament. There they all go off to the battle. Within these traditions, one of the most sacred things for a knight is the sword. The sword is a symbol of one's own determination, of one's bond with God. For them, it is a powerful and sacred element. Thus, the main duty of the blessed squire was to care for the sword. It so happens that young Arthur, when he goes to the city for Kay's first tournament, it was the first time he had ever seen a city, a town. And he is dazzled by it all. In his distraction, he ends up losing Kay's sword to a thief at the very first tournament. What a disastrous start to his career as a squire. Losing the knight's sword at the first tournament. It was the ultimate blunder, the end of his career. It simply could not happen when he realizes that Kay's sword is being stolen right there, and his brother is on the verge of entering the line of combat. Where is the sword? There is no sword. He runs around frantically searching for a sword. He searches and searches, but of course he wouldn't find one, because a sword is not something anyone would just leave lying around carelessly. Eventually, he wanders a bit away from the area where the tournament is taking place, and he sees a sword embedded in a stone just sitting there with no one watching. It seems like such a careless oversight, as people commonly say, just left there for no reason. Well, what if I just borrow it for a little while? No one will notice. After Kay competes in the tournament, I'll put it back. It's an innocent thing, just borrowing. He looks to one side. No one is watching. He looks to the other side. No one is watching. So he goes over and pulls the sword out with all the strength he has. But this idea that no one is watching is one of humanity's greatest delusions. There is always someone watching. There always is. It's remarkable. Have you ever noticed how funny that is? There is always an amateur filmmaker recording everything that happens in humanity. Someone is always watching. It's remarkable. In that moment, he wasn't lying. Then he pulls the sword from the stone, and everyone stops and rushes over. When they arrive, his father, everyone, they ask, "Who pulled the sword from the stone?" "It was me." "How is it you?" "It was me." And then everyone is shocked. No, it can't be this boy. The previous champion returns and puts the sword back in the stone. His father says, "Put it in again," so he does. Then last year's champion steps up thinking, "It should be easier now." He tries, focuses, uses all his strength, but the sword doesn't move. The father says, "Arthur, try again." And he does. He goes there and pulls it out. Everyone exclaimed, "Magic, sorcery. Merlin is involved." Merlin disappeared. Since Arthur's conception, since he took Arthur, Merlin was gone. No one saw him. Merlin appears and says, "No, this isn't a spell, it's a fact. This boy is the son of Uther Pendragon. He has the right to the crown. He is the predestined one." Now imagine the confusion, because the boy wasn't even a knight. He was a squire, a little page, just a youngster, a mere boy. And the knights of the land, powerful, great warriors, were expected to accept a boy like him. Most of them did not accept it. They became outraged and believed that all of this was a trap set by Merlin, and they refused to accept this outcome. One of them, who was Leodegrance, said, "No, I saw what I saw. If this boy is Uther's son, if he drew the sword from the stone, then he is the king." So this is something curious, something interesting about this story, my friends. You will see that the round table of the 12 knights has a direct astrological connection. This is not a coincidence. Leodegrance says he is the sign of Leo. and each of these knights behaves according to what is expected of each of these signs. There is a clear symbolic key here. We will talk a little more about this further on. There is a connection between the 12 knights of the Round Table and the zodiacal circle. So Leodegrance is the only one who accepts Arthur as king. And in this, Merlin takes the boy Arthur into the forest and begins to train him. The boy is bewildered. What is this? I will become king all of a sudden? He doesn't understand anything. And in this, a war begins to take shape between the lion Leodegrance, the knight who had accepted Arthur, and all the others who had opposed him. Is that right? And after receiving some guidance from Merlin, Arthur becomes involved in this battle. All of this, for those who have seen the film, is very memorable. This part where Arthur enters the battle is truly beautiful. Still just a boy, he begins to fight bravely to defend the fortress of the Glory of Grants, which is, in fact, one of the most beautiful moments in the film. While he is fighting, he notices that down below in the well, there is a knight, one of those who most strongly opposed him. He was one of the warriors who most opposed Arthur's leadership, who most resisted the idea of Arthur becoming king. And when Arthur sees this, he throws himself from the castle wall into the moat. He lands on top of this knight, manages to disarm him, and says, "Accept me so that I may spare you and be your king. I do not wish to sacrifice you. I need men like you." And this warrior becomes outraged. Imagine. Never. I would rather die than ever submit to the will of a squire, who is not even a knight. At that moment, Arthur stops and says, "You are right." He hands his sword to him, his enemy, and he kneels down unarmed before him and says, "Make me a knight, so that I may forgive you and become your ally. Make me a knight, so that I may forgive you and accept you as my vassal, as my companion." And he kneels unarmed before the knight who is his enemy. The entire battle halts to witness this scene. It is a demonstration of self-confidence, assurance, and wisdom. This man clearly perceives the level of courage, beyond that of an ordinary human being, that existed in that young boy. And he knights him and places himself at his service, and thus the battle comes to an end. Then the structure of the Round Table begins to take shape. He selects the great knights who were present there. They set out in all directions to journey forth, to bring order to the wars and invasions that existed. This is an interesting point because, according to what is said, if there is any historical basis to it, it would have taken place around the 5th to 6th century AD. This is a curious era because it is said that for 50 years the Saxons did not advance. This has been verified from a certain battle, the Battle of Montbeden, whose leader remains unknown for 50 years. The Saxons were unable to advance into Britain. This is the period known as the Arthurian Circle. Thus, at the moment in the myth when Arthur is accepted as king, he sets out leading his knights, fighting against all the invaders, all the barbarian hordes, bringing peace to the land under a single king. Then everyone gathers together, which is also one of the most beautiful parts of the story, as they assemble atop a mountain around Arthur. Merlin arrives at the center of this circle and says, "Remember this night, tell your children and your grandchildren. Tonight I was with Arthur, for the greatest evil of humanity is forgetfulness." And indeed it is. Human beings forget that at some point they were with Arthur. In other words, they forget that which is most divine and sacred within themselves, the very meaning of their lives. And from that moment on, Camelot is established. A great castle with the 12 knights seated, a magnificent kingdom. An interesting fact about this kingdom is that it was prosperous. From its very beginnings, Camelot was just prosperous and well-governed, guided by its code. The Code of Camelot stated that every knight who sat at its table would wield his sword in service of just causes, whether within or beyond the kingdom. They were committed not to a territorial obligation, but to an ideal, a commitment to justice. Wherever there was a just cause, the sword of the Knights of the Round Table was bound to serve. If a knight refused this duty, he would lose his status as a knight. Thus, they were knights in service of justice, goodness, and nobility, gathering around a great table that, contrary to popular belief, did not have 12 seats, but 13 from the very beginning. This was an instruction given by Merlin. He directed that in the construction of the chambers, there must be 13 seats. It so happened that Arthur gathered all the great knights that existed, and together with himself, there were only 11. Thus, there remained an unoccupied seat. One of them, the 13th seat, became known as the perilous chair, because every time someone presumed themselves worthy to sit there, the chair would open up and the person would fall to the ground. No one was able to sit there, a perilous chair. No one could manage to sit in it. But we will see that those 2 places are already reserved. Their occupants, they are already prepared, they are yet to come. The 12th seat belongs to Lancelot. Who is Lancelot of the Lake? Lancelot, who is very important for us to understand the continuation of the story, because Arthur took as his wife the daughter of Leodegrance, Guinevere. It all begins with her. And in these surroundings, as the marriage is being prepared, as the wedding is being arranged, which was a necessity, for those who are familiar with the codes of honor of medieval knights, the lady represented the soul of the knight. In fact, the symbolism of the lady, of the woman in myths, when it is an elevated symbolism, is connected to the soul. When it is a lower symbolism, it is related to the personality. Such is the case, for example, of Isolde, who represents the soul of the knight. It is also the case of Snow White, who unifies the 7 vehicles, the 7 dwarfs. She is the soul. Now, in the case of the personality, it is an Eve, it is a Medea. Those beings who represent temptation, this is when the woman takes on the role that represents the personality. In this case, among medieval knights, no one would go to war without the handkerchief of a lady. Ideal love, chivalric love, involved nothing physical. It was a love for what the lady represented, which was his own soul. Thus, the king could not reign without having a lady. The lady was the inspiration for all the great knights, and he takes as his wife the young daughter of Leodegrance, Guinevere. However, around the time of the wedding ceremony, this young man appears, a figure whom no one knew where he came from. Lancelot of the Lake, who was the son of a distant king, King Ban of Benwick, and who had been raised by the Lady of the Lake. It is a long story, which I will not go into detail here. The fact is that this warrior bore a curse, for he could not place his sword, the greatest honor, for a knight. He could not place his sword at the service of any king. He was not allowed to. He could only place his sword at the service of a king. On the day he was defeated, he was invincible. No one had ever managed to defeat him. He fought with utmost loyalty and fairness in his battles, but no one could defeat him. This was a curse. He did not take this as a source of pride or vanity. He regarded it as a curse, and so he wandered the world in search of this king, to whom his sword could be of service, but he needed to be defeated first. And so Lancelot, on his journey, approached Camelot and camped by the side of a bridge. And the knights of the Round Table hear of the story, feel their honor wounded, and all go there to challenge Lancelot. He defeats them one by one. All 10, he defeats them all. He sends them all back to Camelot, defeated, the best knights in the world. Have you ever considered what a lesson in morality this is? And so, Arthur finds himself compelled to respond personally. No, I must save the honor of Camelot. I will go there myself and will fight with this warrior. And he goes with his Excalibur sword and fights Lancelot. And it is a very fierce battle, because Lancelot was truly invincible. He possessed an immaterial power that was truly astonishing. And when Arthur begins to fall behind, sensing that he is about to be defeated, he feels his pride wounded and calls upon the powers of Excalibur. He asks that Excalibur help him overcome that man, for as king, he could not allow himself to be defeated. He feels vain, his pride is offended, and he manages to strike a blow with Excalibur, but he wields Excalibur in a reckless manner and wins the battle. However, Excalibur, it is because it breaks. This is something very interesting and highly symbolic. What is the symbol of Excalibur? Why does it break? And it is interesting because you have seen Excalibur. As I mentioned to you, it is associated with willpower, with the highest element that exists within the spiritual part of the human being. Willpower, human determination. And it is said that human will can work for the elements below, those of the personality, and it can also work for the elements above, those of the being of the divine. What happens is that when you use willpower to work for what is below, it becomes desire. And desires are different depending on the plane you are on. We spoke about this just a moment ago, didn't we? The desires of the physical body seek the least possible effort. That which is apparent in the mineral kingdom, it seeks the greatest immensity. The desires of the energetic plane, the greatest possible energy, are greed, the desire for profit. The desires of the emotional plane, the greatest quantity of emotions possible, because it feeds on them. Pure adrenaline, the energy, all the energy it draws from emotions. The desires of the mental plane, constant mental speculation. So these desires are contradictory one with another. What happens then? When the will descends into this material plane, it divides, it becomes different desires. And each vehicle down here has a different desire. Now, when the will is used for spiritual objectives, for honor, for valor, for virtues, it is always one. The objectives up here are one and the same. It is to work for the good of humanity. There is no other. So the will, when it is applied up here, is one. When it is applied down here, it divides. Why did Ascalio divide himself? Because at that moment, Arthur used it for pride, for vanity, for not wanting to be defeated as a man, for not wanting to go through the humiliation of recognizing that there was a knight better than himself. He uses it for the interests of the personality. And in the personality, when it divides, it becomes desire, it splits apart. And that is literally what happens. The individuals end up splitting apart. When he looks, he, as a wise man, as a just God, recognizes it. Well, what madness I have done, I used it. Ascalio placed something where it should not have been used. I broke what should not have been broken. I used what should have worked solely and exclusively for the good of humanity, for my own personal and selfish benefit. I lost everything. And he falls into a scale of consciousness, into such a profound pain of conscience, that Ascalio falls into the waters of the lake where they had been fighting, and the lady of the lake rises again with it, reforged, unified. Through the profound awakening of consciousness he experiences, by recognizing the mistake he had made, he reunifies Scarlet. He gathers its pieces together once more, and he takes Scarlet back into his hands. Well, but Lancelot had been defeated. And so the defeated Lancelot is overjoyed because now he had someone to serve. His curse had come to an end, and he is brought to the table and becomes the 12th warrior. And as the 12th warrior, the best of them all, the inspiration of the table, the music, he would have to be the queen's knight. That was how it was. The best knight was the guardian, the queen's knight. And so he is sent to fetch Guinevere from Leodegrance fortress for the wedding ceremony. That is when things start to get complicated, because when Lancelot arrives to fetch her, Guinevere falls madly in love with him, and he with her. He takes Guinevere as had been arranged, defying the king, defying all the pacts he had made, but he can no longer think of anything else. He is madly in love with her, and she with him. The marriage takes place, but this drama begins, in which Lancelot starts fleeing from Camelot to avoid seeing Guinevere. And Guinevere becomes tremendously anguished because she burns with love for Lancelot. This evidently will have an unpredictable outcome, but sooner or later, neither of them can control this passion. And they end up coming together and consummating the betrayal that will lead to the entire collapse of the Chamber of Conflict. It is curious, very interesting, a passage in the story that shows Lancelot at a moment when the film even includes this scene. In this scene, he is deeply anguished, imagining how he could rid himself of that forbidden love, that love which threatened to ruin everything, and he feels as if he is in a struggle with himself. He is sleeping by the edge of a lake, and he sees himself fully armored coming toward him. And he wounds himself. He enters into a dreamlike combat with himself. He sees himself dressed in armor with a sword approaching and wounding him. And this wound, which is inflicted upon him, never heals. And he will die from this wound. You will see that this is very curious. There, at the end of the story, in the final battle fought against Mordor, he fights fiercely, but he dies from this wound that never heals. This wound that he himself inflicted upon himself, the wound of desire. And it is curious because it is said that man is an immortal being, a divine being, that he condemns himself to mortality because of desire, because he desires things that are mortal. Therefore, he remains bound to this mortal plane by his desires. I mentioned to those who attended the lecture on the symbolism of fairy tales, when the witch comes to Snow White and offers her the apple. She says, "No, I don't want it, thank you." Then the witch resorts to her fatal tactic. "Isn't there something you desire?" There was. She desired that the so-called prince would enchant her, and then she bites the apple. She falls asleep within matter. The apple is universally a symbol of the heart. It means that Snow White had desire in her heart, desire for the material. Therefore, she fell asleep within the apple. This desire that wounds and binds, she had to make it a portal, because otherwise she would even be, thank you, he dies from the wound he himself inflicts, which is the wound of desire. This is very interesting. Therefore, this betrayal will eventually be consummated. The two will end up meeting and staying together. This is discovered by Arthur, and it triggers the unraveling and collapse of Camelot. Arthur falls into tremendous dejection, into immense suffering, and Camelot begins to wither. Remember, you and the land are one. Therefore, when Arthur falls into deep dejection, all of Camelot begins to wither. The land itself begins to fade. He gathers his knights and says, "There is only one way for you to restore Camelot, only one way for us to recover Camelot's vitality." People begin to go hungry, the land withers, everything becomes barren. He says there is only one way. Go out, travel the world, and find the Grail. Whoever finds the Grail and brings it to me will restore Camelot. It sounds like madness, doesn't it? But one thing is connected to the other. What is the Grail? The Grail is the chalice that Jesus Christ used at the Last Supper. That chalice was later used by Joseph of Arimathea to collect drops of his blood at the cross. That is the Grail. What does this have to do with the story? He was betrayed by his wife, and the one who will solve the problem is the Grail. What is the key to this story? What lies behind all this? This is the most symbolic and fundamental element of the story. If you consider that same diagram we drew just a moment ago, which is the diagram of the castle of Mercurio, you will see that Arthur typically represents the spiritual principle. Arthur is the spiritual principle. He is the king who is and will be. He is the one who reigns eternally. Guinevere is the psychic principle. She is the soul. And who is Lancelot? He is the physical body, the perfect soma. Who possesses the most perfect body? The brilliance of Lancelot, brave, courageous, with great self-mastery and endurance. He is the symbol of the perfect body, the soma, the ideal physical aspect. And when these three are united, it is a marvel. Because they are perfect and invincible, they establish an invincible and exemplary kingdom upon the world. These three are within us. When the three work together for a common cause, Camelot exists. Camelot becomes possible. Now, what is the outcome of the story, which is the downfall of humanity? Guinevere, who represents the soul, looks at the body and says, "Oh, how beautiful it is, how wonderful, I love it." And she goes, how many times does the human being? This is the beginning of what we call materialism as a way of life. The human being, in order to spare their physical body, betrays spiritual principles. But if I am too honest, I won't have such a comfortable life. Poor body of mine, it will suffer so much. So one betrays the principles of Arthur. One betrays integrity, betrays honesty, betrays effort, betrays selfless service, because these do not bring profit. One betrays spiritual principles in order to indulge the physical body. This is where the fundamental betrayal begins. The fundamental betrayal is the betrayal of the human psyche. When you fall in love with the body, when you identify with this here. Do you remember Narcissus gazing into the waters? This is the psyche seeing itself in the material plane and falling in love with it. What happens to Narcissus? He turns to stone. This is materialism. This is the human psyche, looking at its reflection in the material, saying, how beautiful it is, I love this, and by loving it, destroys it. Because Lancelot was great, because through Guinevere he spoke to Arthur. When you remove Arthur's principles, Lancelot becomes a beggar, turns into a madman, loses all his strength. When we seek to protect our body without submitting it to spiritual principles, we destroy it through various vices, through countless obsessions, through many weaknesses. We destroy our own body when we do not submit it to spiritual principles. We think we are taking good care of it, but in fact we destroy it through inertia, through obsessions, through vices, through countless weaknesses. When you do not submit the body to spiritual principles, and Lance said, without obeying Arthur, he becomes a beggar, a hermit. The chalice is broken. Then Arthur comes and says, what? Look, there is only one way to recover the bed if you want to find the Grail. This Grail, which was the chalice of the Last Supper, was a mythical, sacred element present in various traditions. In other words, it represented the union of the three worlds. What was the Grail? You can notice something curious because at the beginning of the Arthurian tradition, there was no Grail at all. This was already a process of Christianizing the myths. The chalice of the Last Supper, that is Christianity. First it was a cauldron. This druidic cauldron, the cauldron of the Tuatha Danann, had something very interesting about it because it is very similar to those medieval Eucharistic chalices which are still used today in certain ceremonies. It had a particular feature. The cup, the base, and a protrusion which is like a host. Isn't that so? This is the chalice. You remember this type of chalice that has right in the middle something like a host? This is the real one. It is always depicted in this way, the union of the three worlds. To recover the Grail meant to reunite the spiritual principle with the psychological principle, and with the material physical principle under a single law. The Grail, which is the sacred chalice of the pact between the divine and the human, is the pact of our own divinity, with that which is human within us. It represents the union of the three worlds under a single law, doesn't it? Only the Grail, only through the Grail can a person restore Chambers. Do you understand? So when he says recover the Grail, what does that mean? When a human being reestablishes the Grail within themselves, once again the Chamber will have a chance. Well, and then the knights set out on the quest for the Grail. As you remember from the film, all of them are defeated. All of them are defeated by the spells. These spells are conjured by Morgana, and the knights are defeated one by one, always lost to their own weaknesses, to their own shortcomings. They are defeated and do not find the Grail. Morgana, who in this version by Melody is portrayed as very ambitious, longs to take advantage of Arthur's solitude. She casts a spell, takes on the form of Guinevere, unites with Arthur, and conceives a child with him. the illegitimate son who is Mordred. This Mordred dreams of seizing Arthur's kingdom, and so Morgana performs a series of enchantments and spells, causing one by one the Knights of the Round Table to be defeated without finding the Grail. However, there was one who was predestined, Parsifal the Pure. This is an interesting aspect present in the original story, which the film adaptation does not include. They simplify it, Parsifal the Pure, who is described in great detail. In the works of Wagner and Fassner, he was a young man, the son of Lancelot. It is a very beautiful and fascinating story. He was the 13th to occupy that perilous seat. That chair, which had never before been sat upon, belonged to him. It is said that Lancelot, during that time when he wandered the world, traveling to all corners, fleeing from the Round Table to avoid seeing Guinevere, so as not to fall into temptation, approached a certain kingdom. At that time, a very wise king ruled there, a sage who was King Perez. But this kingdom was under a curse. Every 7 years, a serpent, a dragon, a terrible and destructive creature would appear and devour everything, killing many people as it went. And in that kingdom, there was a prophecy that only when a knight of tremendous courage and nobility passed through would it be possible to slay that dragon. However, this knight, upon defeating the dragon, would have to unite with the princess to conceive with her the noblest and purest knight ever to walk the earth. That was what the prophecy foretold. At that time, King Perez reigned, and his daughter was Elaine. Elaine was a young woman who was said to be, among all the young women who lived in the land, one of the most beautiful, the most virtuous, and the most gifted, making her an excellent match. However, the prophecy fell upon her. It was she who had to unite with Lancelot to bear a child. She had to join with a man who was never cowardly. So, when Lancelot passed through that region, the dragon was in full action, and people would say, "Look, the Knight of the Round Table." Everyone knew that their pact, their vows, were always in service of justice. Therefore, he could not refuse to act. So they went and called Lancelot, and Lancelot went and answered the call. He engages in battle with this adversary, a terrible battle. He manages to defeat him, but it is the most difficult battle of his life, because he is taken to the castle utterly exhausted. And when he arrives at the castle, the king looks at him and says, "My goodness." He didn't say punishment, but something similar. This is not going to work, because this man is Lancelot. The king possessed a magical power, clairvoyance. He looks and says, "No, you will never want to unite with my daughter." Why? He is hopelessly in love with Queen Guinevere. He has a soul pact. He will never unite with another woman. Then he calls Elaine, his daughter, and tells her the story. He explains the situation. "Look, my daughter, the prophecy, part of it, will not come to pass. The knight is here. There's just one detail. He will never love you, this knight who is here. You have no chance with him. So there is only one way for us to fulfill the prophecy. I will do a spell, an enchantment, so that he will unite with you for one night, and only one. You will conceive the warrior who is foretold in the prophecy. But the next morning, he won't even want to know that you exist. Do you accept? If you do not accept, it is out of spite, because this means your entire destiny. Because she was a young woman, imagine conceiving a child in a time like that. To conceive a child out of wedlock, from someone who did not love her. Her entire destiny was at stake, her whole life. And she accepts. Elaine accepts to give her life to fulfill the prophecy. So King Pelles prepares a magical potion. When Lancelot drinks it, upon seeing Elaine, he sees Guinevere, and he spends a night with her, and she conceives Galahad. But the next morning, he realizes it was a spell, an enchantment, and he disappears. He leaves, and Elaine is left waiting for this child. She gives birth to the child, hands him to her father, who is King Pelles, and immediately dies. Elaine now dead, then her father decides to fulfill her last wish. He places her on a boat, guided only by a single man, a mute rower, who silently crosses the river that runs through Brittany, carrying the body of the deceased princess. This part is very curious, very beautiful, because it is said that everyone along the banks of the river would come to watch the silent funeral procession of Elaine pass by. And everyone wept, not for her, who had lost nothing, who desired nothing, but for themselves, who no longer had her among them. This was a very beautiful passage, worthy of reflection. They did not weep for her, because she had lost nothing, since she desired nothing. They wept for themselves, who no longer had her among them. If we pause to reflect, that same passage occurred when Uther, united with a grain, is reborn, transformed into ATU, purified in ATU. The same spell of transmutation will take place there. Because Lancelot is a perfect knight, virtuous, endowed with many virtues, yet he possessed a tremendous desire. Helene is the most beautiful princess, and she has, as her fundamental virtue, the beauty of the soul, the capacity for renunciation. She renounces all her privileges to bring forth this perfect knight. Therefore, the heroism of Lancelot, of Nito, and the renunciation of Helene give rise to the birth of Galahad, this knight who possesses all the heroic qualities of his father and the renunciation of his mother, and who will be destined to find the Grail. On one occasion, then, as Lancelot was returning to Camelot after many of his journeys, he meets Guinevere. He cannot resist her charms, cannot resist his passion, and ultimately he ends up uniting with her. This union causes all of Camelot to fall into disgrace. It is the breaking of the union of the three worlds. It is the breaking of Camelot's pact. Thus, when Arthur becomes aware of this betrayal, he drives the sword of Camelot between the two of them. And Camelot enters into decline. Arthur begins to fall into a deep sadness. He starts to lose all his motivation. He grows weaker as a king, and at the same time, the kingdom of Camelot also begins to deteriorate. There is a very important point within the Arthurian tradition, and within Celtic tradition as a whole, which is the union of the king with the land. You and the land alone. When the king begins to lose his attributes, the land withers from its power. Then the crops no longer grow, there is hunger, there is misery everywhere, and Camelot falls into a great decline. Taking advantage of this situation, Arthur's sister, his half-sister who longed for power, who was Morgana. She also takes on a form, making the king drink a magical potion and believe that she is Guinevere. And with her own brother, she conceives a bastard son, who will represent the very bastard humanity that turns against its own father. Thus, Arthur, faced with all these difficulties and setbacks, becomes deeply saddened. And he calls all his knights and asks them to go out into the world in search of the Grail. For the Grail would be the only way for Camelot to be restored, and so his knights set out across the world. But none of them succeed. This passage is very interesting, because each of Arthur's knights is connected to a zodiacal key, and each of them begins to be defeated, precisely because of their weak point, their vulnerability. And one after another they fall, and none manage to obtain the Grail, so much so that Arthur had already lost hope. When one fine day, a young man, almost an adolescent, appears, accompanied by his grandfather. And when this young man enters the hall, his name automatically appears inscribed on the backrest, on the headrest of the 13th chair, called the Perilous Seat. This young man was Galahad, the predestined one. It was destined for him to achieve the Grail, the Knight of the Round Table. He then sets out on the quest for the Grail, and after many situations, after many trials, he who possessed sufficient purity, for this reason he manages to attain the Grail. Bringing it to Arthur, he enables Arthur, upon drinking from the cup, to regain his strength, his spirit, and to set out, together with those of his knights who remain, with those of his warriors who are left, to face the army of Mordor. It is very important that we understand the symbolism of this passage because it is the central point of the Arthurian myth, the betrayal of Guinevere, which is often misunderstood. We can observe that in many traditions of the past, the human being is considered the conjunction of three elements: a spiritual aspect called nous, a psychic aspect called psyche, and a physical aspect called soma. The union of these three worlds according to a single principle, a single law, would shape the wise human being, establishing the pact between spiritual principles and the material principle. What we can perceive in this myth, as in many others, is that Arthur represents the spiritual principle. Guinevere, the psyche. It is very common that in various myths the woman occupies this role of the psyche. And Lancelot, the perfect soma, the ideal knight. When the three are working according to the same principles, along the same path, this union of the three worlds is established. Camelot, then, is a symbol of the ideal human being. One of the three worlds operates according to the same law, following the same direction. What happens when Guinevere falls in love with Lancelot and betrays Arthur to be with him? It is the human drama. It is the fall into materialism. It is when a person looks at their own body, Lancelot, and thinks it is so beautiful, so attractive, so interesting, and says, "Wow, how beautiful this is, how I love it, I am this," and brings their spiritual principles into play. They turn their back on their spiritual principles in order to preserve their body and end up weakening it, and ultimately break the union of the three worlds. In other words, when a person, out of attachment to their personality, betrays their own being, they are enacting the role of this fundamental betrayal. The betrayal of Guinevere in relation to. So none of the three worlds are preserved. Parents. When Arthur asks Galahad and all his knights to set out in search of the Grail, in truth, the Grail is a very ancient symbol, which originally was not even a chalice. It was a cauldron of the leader that represented precisely the union between these three worlds. Later, this became and was widely used in the Middle Ages in the form of that Eucharistic chalice, which contained the host in the center. In other words, it represents exactly the union of these three worlds. When Arthur proposes this, what is he asking for? That a single human being might once again achieve the union of these three worlds within themselves. This symbolizes the Shadril. If a man does this, it means that he has no chance of recovering. In other words, Arthur, we never learn how to follow a model. Now, it is necessary for a human being to conquer this model within himself, earn the degree, be worthy. And who will do it? Gala, the 13th horseman. It is interesting to notice this because, in fact, the 12 knights of the Round Table have a zodiacal key. That is, there would not be a 13th. There are 12 signs of the 12. So who is Gala? Gala would be the center, the union of the virtues of the 12 in a single point. He would be the culmination of all the times, human virtues, the one who is able once again to conquer himself and unite all his principles, spirit, soul, and body, according to the Mahavir Camelot. Galahad is the ideal man, the hero, the one who traverses this path and regains himself. Thus, the fact that Camelot is reestablished through Galahad is a promise that Camelot is a possibility that can be attained by any and every human being in the universe. Shaping history. He goes into battle, is wounded, does not die, but also wounds death mortally. Already in agony, he calls one of his knights, hands him this branch, and asks him to cast the sword to the side. When once again humanity has the opportunity to reclaim it, this knight will re-emerge. Thus, he casts it exactly as he was instructed to do. The sword vanishes over the waters of the lake, taken by the lady of the lake. Vertically, it disappears. This is very interesting because water is universally a symbol of the material world. Thus, human will, human power submerges beneath materialism, beneath the waters of materialism, and will re-emerge at the moment when humanity, when we once again are worthy of it, and when people once again are worthy to have it before them. Arthur, the spiritual principles. And he, the king who was, is, and will be, is the only one in this entire saga who does not die. He is taken by the ladies of Avalon and rests, waiting for humanity to be ready for his return. And then comes the beautiful part of the book, which is said to happen every year. Once a year, during the festival of Beltane in the month of May, Arthur awakens and opens his hand to me, and his knights gather around him. And he asks, "Is humanity ready for my return?" And his knights reply, "No, my lord, grant us one more year." And once again, he returns to his slumber, and his knights travel the world spreading the good news, and striving to bring us once more to that historic moment when Arthur may return, when Camelot can be restored, for humanity to achieve. And for each person, the turning point comes when humanity recognizes that the highest human destiny is to be shaped by that ideal. This act is inscribed in color, and each human being carries it within. That is it,